Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance by voices within the independent Catholic movement. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. And now, meet your hosts, Reverend Dr. Trish Sullivan-Bonney and Reverend Dr. Jayme Matthias.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan-Bonney.
And for this episode, we're excited to welcome a special guest. Rabbi Charles Arian is an American Reform ordained and later conservative affiliated rabbi, author, and interfaith blogger. He serves as the spiritual leader of Kehilat Shalom in Montgomery Village, Maryland, and is known for his work in Christian-Jewish dialogue, Jewish education, and social justice engagement. Welcome, Rabbi Arian.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here.
Rabbi Arian, what else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Reverend Vani and I were classmates at Georgetown University as undergraduates, and I tell people I am very much a Vatican II rabbi because my vocation as a rabbi was really shaped at Georgetown, and although Georgetown has had Jewish students almost since its very beginning, I don't think it would have been a place that I was comfortable at, prior to the reforms of Vatican II. Having said that, I mean, there was not a large Jewish community there, but it existed. And when I see Jewish life now at Georgetown, it's just astonishing and encouraging.
Right. And I remember those years super fondly, Rabbi Arian, and I don't think either of us had ministry on the mind when we were on the Hill. But it's really a treat to have you with us. It's interesting. You're not my only friend who is a Jesuit educated rabbi. When I moved to Minnesota, we connected with a classmate of my husband's from Holy Cross, Rabbi Norm Cohen, who is a longtime rabbi in the town next to us, who was encouraged by the Jesuits. So a shout out to our brothers in the order for having great hearts for people discovering their own spiritual history, their own theological path, and for cultivating that in a way that was not about proselytizing them. It was about honoring who they were. And that's, in some ways, that's a very Catholic point of view. Certainly, definitely since the Second Vatican Council, definitely since that gorgeous document, Nostra Aetate, which we need to pull out and have everybody read again. And definitely, really, I wasn't a huge fan of JP2, but he broke down a lot of walls. The first pope to come to the Wailing Wall and to pray and to recognize this, amazing legacy that Christians hold in the Hebrew Scriptures. I've been admiring your work for the years that we've been, not together geographically, but touching base here and there on Facebook. Like you, I have a great interfaith heart and do a lot of interfaith work here in Minnesota. And watching the work you've done in terms of justice issues, mobilizing your congregation, engaging in dialogue, the work that you've done with your fellow rabbis and organizations. I think when I told you I was going down to the training for the airport action here in Minneapolis, you're like, oh, I have like 20 rabbi friends who are going to be there. Like there's this whole mob coming of folks that were there to support us and experience what we were all about. So it's with great affection and appreciation that I welcome you onto the podcast with Jayme. One of the reasons I reached out to you is I'm just, we're coming out of the Easter season. This is the season in which poorly translated texts and often horrifying preaching over the centuries set in motion a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism. It's still a reality here in the United States and globally. today we recognize the devastation of the Shoah. I believe today's the day for observance. And, I think, in my years of training as an activist, whether that's around anti-racism work or being an effective ally to the GLBTQI plus community, it's become clearer and clearer to me that it's not incumbent on the people who are in the minority to do the work. It's incumbent on the people who are in the dominant culture who hold more of the power around those questions to do the work. So it's still a topic we need to be talking about. We need to be talking about anti-Semitism still. And I know you do a lot of dialogue with Christian leaders. So I was hoping to start with, the climate here in the United States, what you're noticing, what your colleagues are noticing, what your folks are talking about. And then later I'd like to circle back to some of the tensions that many of us who are um, very deeply devoted to our Jewish brothers and sisters have around the current situation in the Middle East, which is a tender topic, but we'll see what we can do with that. So anyway, so just kind of your state of the world, if you were going to observe a culture and just share with us what you see from your balcony in terms of the Jewish Christian and other dialogues.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think first of all, the first point that you made, I think is really important, and it's something that I have said to my own congregation in terms of anti-Semitism, is that anti-Semitism is not something that can be solved by Jews alone, and we need to devote our energy to building creative and thriving Jewish life, not just to fighting anti-Semitism. Having said that, I mean, the climate is really makes that difficult. I mean, I came across some statistics recently that the American Jewish community overall in 2025 spent $2.5 billion, no, I don't know, a lot. I mean, millions and millions and millions of dollars on security. The average Jewish organization spends 14% of its budget now on security. And Jewish day schools spend over $800 per pupil per year on security. It's a real concern, and we absolutely need to do it. But it diverts resources. I mean, both like financial, but also sort of psychic resources. I mean, in 2020, right, all of a sudden, all of us became epidemiologists, right, and now we're all security experts, and it's a lot. So, allyship is really important. I also think, to have allies, you have to be allies. And, to simply say that, we will not be involved in things that don't directly involve our community, I think is a foolish strategy. As well as the fact that it's also based on an incorrect premise, in the sense that, certainly while the overwhelming majority of American Jews are white passing or white appearing, there are Jews of color, and there are Latino Jews, and there are Asian Jews, and there are Black Jews. And I mean, certainly in Minnesota, I know somebody who left Minnesota because they were just, a Black Jew who was tired of being pulled over all the time and questioned and trying to explain to his 4-year-old why this was happening. So they just left. They're back now, but, so, having said that, look, I mean, the issues that you raised are complicated, okay? Because Israel is part and parcel of my identity as a Jew. I lived there for 4 years. I watch Israeli television, listen to Israeli radio, relish every opportunity I have to speak Hebrew. And people somehow understand that you can love America and despise the current government. And people don't understand that you can love Israel and despise Israel's current government, which I think is harmful to Israel. I mean, not only to the rest of the Middle East, it's harmful to Israel in the long term. But at the same time, so, we live in such a polarized society, right? And I had the absolute, this is like not apocryphal. This really happened. In the same week on social media, I was attacked as a genocide apologist and as a capo. Okay? As a capo by Jews to my right, and as a genocide apologist, actually by a Georgetown classmate of ours, who had suggested that Americans should start going after American Jews to try and influence Netanyahu to change his policies. I'm not responsible for Netanyahu's policies. And I think a lot of the physical attacks on Jewish institutions have absolutely been motivated by opposition to Israel. On the other hand, the Tree of Life attack, which, was the first and worst, was motivated because of Jewish involvement in supporting immigrants. So again, talk about getting, attacked by the left and the right. And so it's a very, very polarized time in American society, and to try and talk about issues with any level of nuance is a Sisyphean task.
Rabbi Arian, my heart is just heavy at hearing your words, especially just, as Catholics and as Christians, we find ourselves looking at the situation from a very different perspective, where we don't have the same security around our churches and schools. And yet, I just think about how it is that here in Austin, Texas, when I drive to our Jewish community center, there's a sort of guard station set up outside where, the identification of every person, every vehicle going in is checked. And it's just, there's a different sense that just really saddens me, that weighs on my heart this morning. And I'm wondering if, from your perspective, or how it is that anti-Semitism has changed, particularly in recent years. I'm thinking about how it was that, only within some 10 years ago, how we had a national event that, that made headlines simply because of the very hateful things that they were saying against our siblings of the Jewish faith. And we recognize within our own tradition how it is that we share this, we share spiritual ancestors, and which makes us siblings. So wondering how it is that it's changed in recent years, but also what are some forms of anti-Semitism that people, and especially well-meaning Christians, might overlook or misunderstand in our world today?
Well, as I said, there is, on the one hand, conflation of American Jews with Israel. Okay, but on the other hand, there's also sometimes a lack of understanding of our ties to Israel. I have on occasion asked, my sermons are very much like a dialogue. They're not so frontal. And I'll say, how many of you have relatives in Israel with whom you are in touch? And it's usually about 50% of the congregation. Right. So, again, which does not at all translate into support for any particular policy, right? But when people talk about dismantling the state of Israel, right? I mean, so what's supposed to happen to the 7 or 8 million Israeli Jews who live there? And people generally have no answer for that. So I think, look, it is complicated, right? Because I just saw on CNN yesterday statistics about the decline of support for Israel, across the board, and it's not just on the left; it's also on the right. But again, what does it mean to say support for Israel? We tend to blur distinctions, right? If somebody asks me, do I support Israel? Well, what does that mean? Do I support the existence of the state of Israel? Yes, right? Do I support the right of the Palestinians to their own state? Yes. Do I think Israel should be a Jewish state? Yes. Do I think Israel should be a state of all its citizens? About 1 million or 2 million of them are being Palestinians, mostly Muslim, but some Christian. Also, yes, right? So these are complicated issues. I think that, the type, I see it routinely that somehow Israel is responsible for the current war. And I just don't think that's the case. Trump is responsible for the current war. He's done it for reasons of his own that I think he doesn't even understand. To blame to blame Israel, which then translates into blaming the Jews for the current war, it just, revives that kind of old Trump of the, malevolent, all-powerful Jewish conspiracies.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a problem. But there's also, I see a kind of, and I'm hesitant to call it anti-Semitism as much as anti-Judaism. But and I see this, certainly among progressive Christians, to talk about Pharisaism, right? The people that you call the Pharisees, we call our sages of blessed memory. Or legalism, I saw somebody, I don't even remember who, but it was a progressive Christian, saying, well, Hegseth's Bible ends at the Old Testament, and and he hasn't gotten to the New Testament God of love. Well, there's plenty of love in the Hebrew scriptures too.
I have had that conversation with multiple rabbi friends over the years. And so one of the things I would exhort our listeners to do is come to a better understanding of Judaism. A lot of us were given that trope, Rabbi Arian. We were told, that this was the Old Testament God, this is the New Testament God. Even the words Old Testament communicate a whole world of meaning, right? And so you have to actively move yourself past that. On my Easter homily, I mentioned that the scholarship that very likely Jesus was a part of Hillel's school. A lot of what Jesus says comes right out of Hillel, right? So these are the things that in our preaching and in our choices of the way what types of translations we use in our Christian settings are Super important. I'm wondering if maybe we could pull it back because I grew up in Hackensack, New Jersey. And as a result, I had quite a few Jewish friends. I grew up in a very diverse community, culturally, religiously, ethnically, very, very diverse city. And I was blessed by these wonderful friends who took me to everything at their synagogues. And my mother was, you mentioned Vatican II. My mother was this Vatican II on fire young Catholic mom who thought it was great that I was going for Rosh Hashanah. And it was great that I was going to go for Purim. And it was great that she was always encouraging me. So I had a very different exposure to Judaism as a youngster. And my most profound spiritual experience of my life had happened when I was 13 in a synagogue. So I have always had this like deep affinity for Judaism. I'm wondering if you could just do a little riff on things like Tikkun Olam and, what really shapes the worldview of our Jewish brothers and sisters in terms of justice, in terms of the call of the human person to the human family and all of that. I think there are some people may not have been exposed to that.
Right. Well, so the phrase tikkun olam means repairing the world, right? But it's only become sort of popular. I don't know in the last, I'm tempted to say 20 years, but when I say 20 years, I really mean 40, 45, right? Because if I say 20 years ago, I'm thinking 1980. Right? But frankly, in rabbinic Judaism, tikkun olam does not mean progressive social action. It, in fact, in some ways, like in the Talmud, tikkun olam is actually a very conservative concept. And I don't know how deep into the woods you want to get with it, but there is the law that you have to allow people into your fields to glean. And during the sabbatical year, anybody can come into your fields to pick whatever grows of itself, right? And then the Talmud says that the farmer can put up fences to control access, not to prevent it, but to control it, because otherwise you just have chaos. But for reasons of tikkun olam, the farmer is allowed to put up a fence, okay? And in that sense, tikkun olam means like the orderly function of society, right? I mean, for me, what really motivates it is more the biblical commandment to remember that we were strangers, to love the stranger, because we know the heart of the stranger. Okay, and one of the things that's been motivating me over the last few years is literally the last conversation that I had with my dad before he passed away. I was talking to him on the phone and he was very upset. And I said, Dad, what's going on? He told me he was watching news coverage of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and those horrible scenes of people at Kabul airport, like literally hanging on to the airplane, the wings of the airplanes to try to get out. And he said, when I look at those poor people, I see us. And that was, I think, my dad's modern midrash on, the heart of the stranger, right? Because, look, my dad was born in 1929. Both of his parents were refugees from Eastern Europe. They had cousins, they had siblings left behind, right? And who, frankly, could have gotten out, but there was nowhere in the world that would accept them, right? Which is, frankly, to circle back, why there needs to be a state of Israel, right? So that when you have to flee, there's some place where they will take you in, right? Because our country ain't going to do it, right? I mean, but that idea of, right, what is hateful to you, do not do to others, right? Talking about Hillel, right? He said that's the whole Torah, right? And all the rest is commentary.
That's the quote I use.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so, looking at our own history of persecution, looking at our own history of not being accepted, looking at our own history of not having a place that we could flee to, right? Looking at our own history of being hated just because of who we were. That to sit idly by the blood of our neighbors, right, and watch this happening to others is a betrayal of our whole legacy.
I think it's so profound, and it really is our legacy too. That's the thing Christians like forget. I mean, I love your observation that, when I see that person, I'm seeing myself. That was a big theme here in Minnesota in the
Sure.
wintertime, right? These are our neighbors. This is us you're pulling, right?
Right.
Out of homes and cars and all of that.
Right. And it should be even, sorry for interrupting
No,
you,
jump
but
in.
I'm also from New Jersey, so I come out.
We overtalk.
Yeah. But I think for a Christian, all the more so, right? Because when you're a Christian and you do that to somebody, you're doing it to Jesus. Right? I mean, you're doing it, right? The person that you're pulling out of the car and beating and throwing into jail is Jesus, right?
That's right. That's what we teach.
Right? To us, it's imago Dei, right? But to you, it's like, I mean, yeah. And I think, look, I mean, I do immigrant accompaniment work. And I would say roughly half of the people that I encounter as fellow volunteers are Jews. And I think that that's no accident, right? And, and also, I mean, every election, right, I hear from Jewish Republicans, this is going to be the year. This is going to be the year that American Jews finally wake up and vote Republican. And then, 20% do and 80% don't. And it's not because, and I think it is really because of these kind of, culture war type of issues that, hatred doesn't always start with anti-Semitism, but it always ends up at anti-Semitism, right? And whether that is Islamophobia, whether that is, homophobia, whether it is whatever, right? The minute you give license to hatred, it's going to get to us at some point.
Jayme, I know you haven't had a chance to ask a question, but I do want to say one more thing, and then you can jump in. Listening to your story about your dad, Rabbi Arian, it immediately took me to the evacuation of Saigon in my mind, which also took me to those amazing marches in the 60s, and who were the people walking shoulder to shoulder with Martin Luther King and the Black clergy of the South. Well, it was the rabbis and the nuns and the priests. And one of the things that's, useful for Catholics to recover, and I do think that one of the issues here in the United States is a kind of white amnesia, that we don't remember our own stories enough in some of our white communities, is how tremendously marginalized Catholics were along with their Jewish neighbors. I want to encourage our listeners to take the time to pull up a show that's on demand right now, um, and it's the Ken Burns program that was recorded in 2020 about American complicity in the Shoah and the choices that were made by, and he says it this way, so I'm going to say it this way, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant power to not receive people who were Jewish, the pressure on the Jewish leaders to uh, protect thinking they were protecting the Jewish community abroad and here. Just really important history, really important for Catholics to remember that, my grandmother, was turned away by landlords because they didn't want the dirty Irish, literally to her face. I have dual citizenship with Ireland, and I feel the same kind of cultural, national love and affinity for that country that I see in many of my Jewish friends. So, I really want to exhort everybody to education around the backdrop in this country of these issues. Jayme, you probably are poised with like 6 questions knowing you. So I'm going to mute myself now.
Rabbi Arian, what a delight to have you with us, especially speaking about the orderly functioning of society in biblical times. I'm fascinated myself by the whole intersection between faith and public life. And since you're with us, I know that you write a lot about ethics and public responsibility. Wondering what it is that you might share with our listeners in that respect. As a religious leader myself, I'm very interested in the role that religious leaders might play today in political discourse. We're very aware of the fact that today, April the 15th, is tax day, how it is that we are paying money into federal taxes. I believe it was, did I read some 13 to 15% of which goes toward our military spending as a nation, so much more to ICE detention and, other things that maybe people of good conscience find themselves unable to support. So I'm very interested in what it is that in your research and writing, especially on ethics and public responsibility, what it is that you might say to us, and both to our listeners who might be, very engaged lay leaders, but also to those of us who are in ministry. How do we walk this fine line between speaking prophetically without alienating the people of God? I like to say here at Holy Family that we check our politics at the door, but there are so many ways in which the issues of the outside world are just coming into our congregation like never before. So I certainly welcome wisdom in that respect.
Wisdom is a tall order, but I can share some thoughts. Let's put it that way. Look, I mean, I think partisan politics has no place in houses of worship, right? I mean, as a matter of fact, I mean, I have a rule, right? A personal rule that I do not endorse candidates, right? I mean, the IRS laws say that you can endorse a candidate as a private citizen, but not on behalf of your church, synagogue, mosque, whatever, right? But I don't, even as a private citizen. I'll tell you, when we lived in Norwich, Connecticut, my wife was a candidate for the Board of Education. I did not endorse her. I did vote for her. She did win. She managed somehow to win without my endorsement, but I don't endorse candidates, okay? But the minute you start talking about issues of ethics and morality, whether it is war or immigration or healthcare or any issue under the sun, it is inherently political, right? I mean, the Torah is an inherently political book. It's about how we create a society the way God wants it to be. And when people talk about, oh, I don't want politics from the pulpit, they mean I don't want politics that I disagree with from the pulpit. But I do think that you should be respectful to perspectives that you don't share, right? I mean, otherwise you really do, exclude people. You know, look, sometimes that's a challenge, right? But but you're mentioning today being April 15th. That is a very complicated issue that I've thought about a lot, right? I mean, because on the one hand, look, I have been very visible, public, out there in terms of immigration stuff, right? I mean, there was a large rally, Jews Against ICE, on February 11th in front of ICE headquarters. I helped organize it. I drive around with an Abolish ICE bumper sticker on my car. So I'm not exactly, quiet about these things, because I have said, I will die on my feet rather than live on my knees. But I pay my taxes, I mean, look, and I'm quite sure that if I told the treasurer of my synagogue, stop withholding taxes, he would do so, right? I mean, he wouldn't be happy about it, and he would warn me about it, especially since he's an attorney. But he probably would comply. And, and at this point, I'm not yet willing to take that risk, okay, which is complicated, right? I mean, interestingly enough, I was thinking about this morning, right? I mean, and we haven't gotten into this, but, one of the people, on whom I cut my spiritual teeth was Thomas Merton. And, I was very fortunate. A few years ago, my wife is originally from Kentucky, and we visited. I was invited to give a couple of lectures at Gethsemane. And, we stayed in the family guest house where, Abraham Heschel stayed when he visited Thomas Merton. And, I felt both of their ghosts in that room. There's this poem that I come back to very frequently, a Merton poem, chant to be used around in processions around a site with furnaces, right? And the last line is about a Nazi concentration camp commandant who was hanged. And he said, you smile at my career, but you would do as I did if you knew yourself and dared. Do not think you are better than me because you burn up enemies and friends with long-distance missiles without ever seeing what you have done, right? And he wrote that in the early 60s. The difference is now we do see what we have done because it's broadcast live, And Rabbi Heschel wrote, in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible, right? So I simultaneously protest against the war while paying for the war. I protest against ICE while paying for ICE. And a Catholic theologian friend of mine says, well, this is what she means, at least, by original sin, is that you are caught up in this web of complicity that you really can't get out of. And I get that. I mean, I'm not sure how Jesus fixes that, but that's a different issue. But if I understand by original sin, not, sex or whatever, but the fact that simply by living as part of a society, you are complicit. And I have no answer. I mean, I guess I could say that, there come times when we have to say, right, do I want to be right or do I want to be effective? right? And if I'm trying to influence society, can I do it more from the pulpit or from the jail cell? Right? On the other hand, I mean, Thoreau went to jail, and lots of rabbis went to jail. Some of whom, my elders, but people that I knew or know.
Rabbi Arian, I have a feeling that this conversation is going to be of a special interest to so many Catholics and Christians. You describe yourself as being a Vatican II rabbi, which I just love that expression. You talk about cutting your spiritual teeth on Thomas Merton. There's something else about your background that absolutely fascinates me and that may be of interest to our listeners as well. And that is that 30 years ago, you found yourself as a scholar in residence at the Trappist Abbey of New Clairvaux in California, exploring contemplative spiritual practices across faiths. And I'm just wondering what insights you might share from that experience. There's this affection that I have in my heart for you, not ever having met you before,
Right.
but just knowing of this affinity that we have, and especially that you have for the great spiritual tradition that we share. So would love to sit at your feet for a moment and enjoy listening to you talk about your explorations there.
Yeah. For me, I mean, monasticism, has, not like anything that ever attracted me as, something that I, for my own life. I mean, I was single at the time. But, the appreciation of being able to live a life that is really devoted to the quest for God, right? And freed of some of those kind of externalities. And in the Trappist or the Benedictine tradition, really of ora et labora, right? That there's a dignity in manual labor, which I think is something that the kibbutz movement shared originally. And I think also an appreciation of silence. Okay. I mean, a friend of mine, Rabbi Aryeh Cohen, who teaches at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in LA, said to me shortly before I went off to New Clairvaux, he said, there's two types of spirituality. There's the spirituality of the joyful noise and the spirituality of silence. And he said, we Jews do the spirituality of the joyful noise really well. We don't do the spirituality of silence almost at all. And I think Aryeh was right. And, as somebody who is an off the chart introvert. I mean, I function in an extroverted way, like all clergy have to do. But, when I've said this to my congregants, that the majority of clergy are actually introverts, and people are astonished, but it's true. But I'm an off the chart introvert. And so, the spirituality of silence really speaks to me. In ways that are very, very difficult to find in the Jewish community, I think. But the other thing is that, I mean, to circle back, to the questions of, and I'm going to say anti-Judaism rather than anti-Semitism per se. Okay, but when Holy Week rolled around, I had been at New Clairvaux for several months, and I attended the Easter Vigil, and I found it really, really, really disturbing because I experienced it as supersessionist. That is to say, right, that all of the stories from the Hebrew Scripture function merely as prologue to Jesus. And I think you have to see, if you're a Christian, you have to see them functioning as prologue to Jesus, but not only as prologue to Jesus, right? And can a story hold two meanings at the same time, right? And it finally, it was the only time this ever happened there in 10 months. I got so upset that I got up and left, right? And over the next few days, a number of the monks sought me out and they said, yeah, as I was listening to that liturgy, I was asking myself, how must Rabbi Charles be hearing this? Right. And so, it's, and I didn't have to say anything. I was just, being there, and that, that dialogue just of presence, right? And that dialogue, just of being part of the community, I think was really fruitful. And yeah, and it's just kind of my presence that helped them to see, because I think this is part of the issue for many Christians, is that they don't understand Judaism, that Judaism is not just Christianity without Christ, that it is its own ongoing, developing tradition that didn't just stop because Jesus came on the scene.
Yeah,
right?
that's
and,
so.
and we evolved really from a common origin, but in different directions.
Right.
And that interchange can be really fruitful. I mean, I have a tendency, frankly, to see responses to Christianity in rabbinic writings all over the place, that may or may not actually be there, right? It's one of my seminary professors called, parallelomania. But to me, there's no question that the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud were in dialogue with the church fathers. I mean, maybe not like literally talking to each other, but certainly, intellectually in dialogue. Sometimes productively and often like not so productively, but it was still, they were aware of each other and, not totally separate from each other. I mean, Daniel Boyarin has done a lot of interesting work in this. That the split between Judaism and Christianity was much later than most people imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. And it's this area of, sort of underdeveloped sense of Christian history. I am really struck by your um, phrase, the dialogue of presence. And that really is true, that when there are new listeners, suddenly there's like a light cast on what we're doing. I do want to talk a little bit about the practicality of how do we get to know each other better? How do we come to a deeper understanding of each other? And I want to call out what I think of as a sort of common Christian misstep. I'll give the first example I had. Well, this is an example of a different kind of misstep, but it's in the same bucket. When I first moved to Minnesota, and of course I had done a lot of interfaith work throughout my life, the wonderful Roman Catholic parish of which I was a part had taken Dayenu and had added all kinds of statements at the where it would have normally ended at the Seder, added all this stuff about Jesus. And my hair was on fire. So, and I tried talking about it and nobody got it. I'm like, do you understand this is supersessionism? This is something the church condemns. And yet they felt like, no, this isn't. So I finally had to enlist the help of Rabbi Barry Citron at the Center for Jewish Christian Relations to get behind me. And I'll tell you, people were mad at me for a number of years because I ruined their great prayer. The
Mm,
other area that, is very common in Christian churches is to do, forgive this word, but this is how I feel about it, bastardized seders.
mhm,
So we're all going to get together and we're going to have a Seder dinner. And, changing the Seder prayer, not including Jewish neighbors, I find it problematic on so many levels. I have a lovely rabbi friend in LA who had written a Haggadah with added like commentary, and we got this idea that I should take it and then put in a Christian commentary, because what do you do? Like on the one hand, both Michael and I were both saying like, don't do this. On the other hand, if you're going to do it, could we do it in a way that you're informed, that you're not overlaying all of this Christian interpretation onto the Seder? We couldn't get it published because it was too hot. People, it was
mhm.
that tension, right? So I'd love to hear from your experience, like what are the best ways for, like, some listeners here, many of them are congregational leaders. What kinds of things could they be doing and with their folks to deepen their understanding of Judaism in a non-supersessionist way, and become more meaningful allies? I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that the best way is like study and dialogue, okay? And not worship, okay? Because you know, look, I mean, and one of the reasons I switched from Reform Judaism to Conservative Judaism is my love of the traditional liturgy, right? And so, I mean, any Christian who contacts me, and unfortunately, you do have to contact me because otherwise the guard won't let you in. Um, but if you want to come to services, you are welcome, right? But you are almost certainly going to be completely lost because we worship in Hebrew. Um, and I want to, avoid the temptation to be, changing fundamentally what we do because, we have non-Jewish guests. Um, but I think study together is really important, and that gets me back to what I said about the sages and the church fathers. I'd love to say church fathers and mothers, but you know I don't want to be anachronistic either. Being in dialogue with each other, right? And typically, like even when a church and a synagogue get together, so they say, well, we'll study, a Jewish text and a Christian text, right? So we'll study something from the Old Testament and something from the New Testament. No, 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 no. All right, because the Hebrew scriptures are not a Jewish text. They are a Jewish text and a Christian text, right? And it's much better, right, to study a text from the Hebrew scriptures and then something from the New Testament that relates to it and something from rabbinic literature that relates to it, right? Because again, it's not right that again, and this is something that both Jews and Christians tend to believe. There was Judaism out of which grew Christianity. No, there was biblical religion out of which grew roughly at the same time Christianity and rabbinic Judaism, which were in dialogue with each other and in a certain sense different answers to the same question, right? How do we live in a world devoid of the temple? How do we gain atonement in a world devoid of the temple? Right. So, um, I sort of understand the desire to have church seders and so on and so forth. Uh, I mean, and I think sometimes, and I talk about this a little bit during Passover, is that Jews don't really understand the continuity that the church perceives with right? I mean, why is Jesus called the Lamb of God, right? Because, right, Jesus is for Christians, right? The Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice. So it's natural, but it also, I mean, the problem, to get back to my story of the Easter Vigil, is when Christians essentially do Jewish rituals in a way that says Jews don't even understand the meaning of their own rituals, right? I mean, if you look at some of the Christian Seder liturgy, right, why are there three matzahs, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? Why do we break the middle matzah, right? Because the middle matzah represents Jesus, whose body was broken on the cross, et cetera, et cetera. And if you want to say, look, this is a Christian midrash on a Jewish ritual, I don't love it, but it's not as offensive as saying, it's one thing to say this is a way that Christians might relate to it. It's another thing to say this is really what it means, right? Which is what some of these church seders do, and in the same way that to say, well, Jews don't understand their own scripture, right? Which is what the church pretty much said until the early 1960s. So it's a problem, and I think that problem is attacked by simply studying together. And what does this mean to you?
Rabbi Arian, I do have one question that I'd love to ask in light of you're talking about churches and synagogues getting together. And the question is this: if you could preach one message to both Jews and Christians right now, what would that message be, brother?
I would say right now, the house is on fire. Don't throw more fuel on it, and don't have litmus tests for your fellow firefighters.
Well said. Rabbi Arian, we've come to the point in our conversation where we typically tend to think about final words and final thoughts. If you don't mind, I'll jump in first, and then I'll give it to Reverend Trish, and then we'll give you the final word. I just want to thank you, Rabbi Arian, on behalf of all of our listeners here, for helping to open our eyes. We have such a rich, shared spiritual connection as siblings, and yet there's just something so deeply disturbing from my perspective about the fact that you and our Jewish siblings are persecuted far more than what we can appreciate or understand, and that just weighs heavily on my heart. And so, I just want to say that if there's anything that I and or we can do beyond thoughts and prayers, I think that this is the time for us to be thinking about concrete actions for how it is that we can be standing up for one another and showing the unity that makes us all so much more strong. So thank you. Reverend Trish?
I am so grateful you came on. Thanks so much, Rabbi Arian. I'm struck by, this in this climate we're in of sort of epic polarization on dozens of issues, it feels, that we have to figure out how to talk about these things. And I think in the complexity of it, I have a great heartbreak for the Palestinian people. And at the same time, I'm very clear about the value of the state of Israel. And I'm very clear about the beauty of Judaism. Um, and the cost to Christians of supersessionism, to be honest with you. So I'm just really glad we could have a conversation where we could talk about those things. I really want to urge our listeners to do your homework. Seek out good conversation partners. Do get that study group going. Um, Stay open to the fact that this is not a handled issue in this anti-Judaism is not a handled issue in the United States, nor is it globally. With, the other data I heard the other day was more than 400 people dying. The most grave event of last year, and that's just last year, was the terrible murders at Hanukkah in Australia. That we have to be willing to address all of the systemic issues that surround this, and particularly as Christians, to own up to the way we were complicit in so much for centuries. And we need to keep working on this. It's just an issue that's super, super close to my heart. And just also to say to you, as my Hoya brother, that your activism inspires my activism. And, we'll all keep, tilling the field until justice rolls like a river, as our common prophet said. So you get to say the final words as we close out our time together.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that, I guess I come back to, what Heschel and Merton both said about accepting responsibility and, responsibility for our own like personal and communal complicity and responsibility for members of our community who perpetrate these things. I mean, it's like, very few things frustrate me more than Christians who say, well, Christianity is about love. So all of these people who did these horrible things weren't really Christians. Because if they were truly Christians, they wouldn't have done those things, right? And here, I think, Pope John Paul II really started the ball rolling and said, no, that's just too easy. We have to accept responsibility, right? I mean, he would never say that the church sinned, right? Because theologically that can't happen, but members of the church sinned, right? And similarly, I ask myself, I mean, I had a conversation with, I've also been like really involved with the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And, I got to meet his attorney, who is Jewish and whose mother is one of the great Jewish social action heroines of recent times. And I was talking to him about another highly placed attorney in the Department of Injustice's immigration section, who's a graduate of Yeshiva University. And I said, his parents ought to ask for every nickel they ever sent to that place for tuition, because he clearly learned nothing. And we have to accept responsibility for the Jared Kushners and Stephen Millers of the world, like, do they understand anything about Jewish history? Do they understand anything about Jewish scripture? And look, I mean, Jared Kushner is not Jewishly illiterate by any stretch of the imagination, right? But you can you can know a lot and understand very little.
Yeah, well, if you're going to take responsibility for them, then Jayme and I will take responsibility for Hegseth and the Supreme Court. I do want to do one little record correction, which is I was relying on my getting older memory, and Yom HaShoah was yesterday, and I want to urge our listeners, mark these dates on your calendar. Observe them. Make sure that you mention Kristallnacht in your preaching in the fall. Own these moments in your preaching. And my last piece of theological advice is read Nostra Aetate. That is to this day, it is a critical document, not only for our relationship with our Jewish siblings, but for our relationship with our Muslim siblings and all of the great faith traditions of the world. Rabbi Arian, so wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much for giving your time. I know you didn't want to call it wisdom, but I'm going to call it wisdom, and all these insights that you shared with us and with our listeners. I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan-Vani.
And I'm Dr. Jayme Matthias.
And we thank you for dialing in to
Cutting Edge
Extraordinary Catholics.
Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. Keep the faith.